Imagine starting your career with a simple choice. Do you want brains or do you want people skills? IQ is raw brain power. It is outsmarting your competitors. EQ, on the other hand, stands for emotional intelligence, and it is how you interact and relate with your peers. EQ gives you the confidence to pitch your new venture to investors. It gives you the charisma to recruit the most talented folks out there. And it gives your team trust because they know you'll always have their back, even when things go wrong. In this video, I'm going to show you 7 ways that you can build your EQ and develop your social intelligence. I'll cover strategies like active listening, understanding decision making, and how to be vulnerable without cringy oversharing. But before we jump into this video, if you're an ambitious and driven professional looking to make a bold career pivot, maybe because you're burned out, maybe because you want to live deeper in alignment, we have a group coaching program for you over at radreads.co/coaching. First, I want to say, why did I use the phrase social intelligence versus emotional intelligence? And I really wanted to distinguish the two because so much about emotional intelligence, or EQ, is around self-awareness and about knowing yourself. And we've actually covered this topic really often on this podcast. And so I want to pivot it more to how do you socialize with others, but it's not really networking we're talking about. It's really the interactions that you have with other folks, how you converse with them, how you energetically vibe with them. These are the questions that I want to tackle in the lens of social intelligence. So I'm going to start first with active listening. Active listening, this is our first point. Active listening is where I want you to remember this rule. It's the 90-10 rule. Now, whenever I meet someone, I was always reminding myself about this rule. And what the rule says is 90% listening, 10% talking. Let that sink in, because if you're listening to this podcast, you probably are a pretty driven person. You probably have a tendency to want validation from others. You probably like the sound of your own voice. And I'm speaking about all these from experience. And so you want to jump into the conversation and just be like, me, look at what I did. Look at what I'm working on. Look at how smart I am, right? And as you're developing social intelligence, this actually will completely backfire, because guess what? The person on the other side of the table usually wants all of those things as well, right? So the 90-10 rule is to basically just listen. And as hard as it is, I want to give you a few ways that you can actually do this quite easily. So the first is to, whenever you're conversing with someone, actually have awareness of what's happening in your body, right? We are cerebral thinker beings, especially if you're listening to this, watching this, always in our head, always thinking, what's the next thought I should say? What's the next thing I should bring up? What do I have to do here? We might get distracted. But if you can just drop into your body and realize that, one thing that I would always do is wiggle. I'm actually doing it right now, is wiggling your toes gently, right? Because that's just enough activity and stimulation that your mind can't wander, because you're kind of like, oh, remember to wiggle my toes, but limited enough that you can actually still really focus to someone. So people use the breath, people use toe wiggling. Another way to do this is just eye contact, just that piercing but gentle eye contact, not looking away, not looking at your surroundings, definitely not looking at your phone. That thing where both people put their phones down. It's almost like putting your gun down on a table and you're like, I'm going to rest my gun on this table, my phone. I would encourage you to keep your phone out of sight, leave it in a bag. Don't even have it in your pocket. It should be on vibration anyway. But again, that eye contact, that warmth in connection. There are studies that have shown that if you break people who break eye contact are less trustworthy, are perceived as less trustworthy. And I think the statistics, they plummet, right? So to my younger folks, I'm a Gen X, but to my millennials, to my Gen Zs listening to this, where this kind of the nervous phone twitch is even more powerful. Pay attention. Think about this. Every time you break eye contact, someone is the human instinct is losing trust in you, right? So back to active listening. Other ways that you can do this is paraphrasing and mirroring. You'll notice people who are really good at sales, they do this all the time. So you might say, I've been really struggling trying to find more time to make a hobby, to pursue my hobby. And the person on the other side might say that back to you. It's like, yeah, I can imagine how hard it is to find the time to have a hobby, especially when you have kids, when you travel a lot, and so on. And again, I don't want you've heard my talks on networking. I don't want any of this to come across as insincere and disingenuous. It is just how you show up with someone and basically changing or modifying the way that you show up, right? So paraphrasing, saying something back to a person. And that's really because at the end of the day, I started this in the video, so much of our human needs and desires come back to a simple fact that we want to be seen. We want to be heard. We want to be understood. We want to be loved. So that leads to my next question, tactic on this active listening. A great way to pursue active listening is to ask extremely, extremely open-ended questions. You could say something like, "Tell me more. Why did you do that? Can you elaborate?" Right? Instead of kind of priming the pump with questions like, "Oh, when you chose to quit this job and do this, what were you feeling?" Right? Instead, you can say, "How did it feel? In that moment, what were you thinking?" Right? And here's an interesting thing that happens when you ask these open-ended questions. Oftentimes, if the person is a little shy or not comfortable around you, or you just don't have a lot of history, there might be some trepidation to walk into that silence, right? And again, here is where the 90-10 rule really kicks in, is that oftentimes when there's an uncomfortable silence, people want to fill that silence, especially if you ask the question, people want to fill that silence with more talking, right? You'll see these like great podcast hosts, great interviewers, they pause and they like sit in that uncomfortable silence, knowing that there's more that the other person wants to say. So again, I almost think of this when I meet people, I think of these uncomfortable silences in this playful way. It's almost like a game of chicken, right? When two cars are coming across, careening towards each other, that game that I guess people play in the movies, who's going to be the first to flinch? I'm like, in this game of silence, air quotes, chicken, I'm not going to be the one to lose. All right. Number two, this ties to the decision making, the open-ended silence listening question, is to understand people's decision making process. So an interesting story that I always like to say about this is in finance, there is this firm. It's a proprietary trading firm, which basically means they trade their own money. They don't have any investors. They're not publicly traded. And they're in this tiny suburb of Philadelphia called Bala Cynwyd. I might be pronouncing this wrong. Cynwyd. I'm pretty sure it's Bala Cynwyd. And this firm is called Susquehanna, or also SIG, might be their abbreviation. And Susquehanna is very well known for trading options and ETFs, right? So they make they might trade an option on Microsoft against an option on Google and capture that small difference between the two. So this firm, super secretive. The founder is Jeff Yass, which that name might sound familiar for a less obvious reason, which come back to later. But anyway, this firm Susquehanna is this firm that just prints money. And they've also kind of become, and this might have changed in the recent years, they've kind of become a training ground of a certain type of trader, also like a certain type of intellect, right? And so from Susquehanna, they also have very tight non-compete, so very few people leave. But from Susquehanna, you have these other kind of spin-offs. Like a very popular one that you might have heard of is a firm called Jane Street, right? And Jane Street kind of took some element of Susquehanna's strategy and they implement that. And from Jane Street, famous Jane Street, there's a bunch of famous Jane Street alumni, but one of the more controversial ones or disgraced ones is Sam Bankman-Fried, right? Jane Street. He was at Jane Street and he learned a lot of kind of ways of trading that he wanted to go apply it to crypto. Now you're probably saying, okay, you just talked about active listening. Now you're talking about decision making. Why are you telling this story about Susquehanna? The reason I tell this story about Susquehanna is like as you move through this kind of org chart of, so to speak, of all these entities that are linked from, Jeff Yaz, who's probably in his 60s, by the way. He's a huge investor. He's the founder of Susquehanna. He's one of the first investors in TikTok. He's actually made more money from TikTok, presumably, than from this highly, highly profitable trading firm that he runs. But when you go from Jeff Yaz, who's probably, like I said, 60s or 70s, to Sam Bankman-Fried, who's probably 33, there's just all these things that are happening in between. There are decisions that are being made. There are ideas that are being birthed. There are physical choices, like, taking this idea, starting it in New York, starting it in Philly, right? There are changes in the market, like the advent of ETFs that lead to this. And I'm saying all this because people get pulled into these stories. People have this for themselves, right? And so one of the best ways to build social intelligence is to find out why people made certain key decisions in their lives. Now, this goes back to the first point, which is people love to hear themselves talk, especially they love to talk about the things that they're proud of. And so first of all, if you meet someone, try to understand all the decisions that they've made during their lives. And then from that list of decisions, then try to pick apart or understand better why did you make that decision? Why did you choose to marry this person? Right? It's a rather personal one. Why did you choose to pick finance over technology? Right? Why did you choose to spend that year abroad when you were 25? Right? Why do you donate this much money to this church every year? Why do you tithe? Right? And so all of these questions really build that connection because people are taking you through their internal thinking, their internal decision-making framework. You will be able to extract some of their own life principles from this decision-making. All right? Okay. So social intelligence. Number 3, understand emotions, right? And specifically understanding, again, what people are feeling, both in the moment when you're interacting with them and as they've lived their life, right? Where were they feeling pride? Were they feeling pride when they got an exit? Or were they feeling shame when they got fired? These are obviously very obvious emotions. Sometimes one thing that I've realized with people who are actually very successful and financially well off is that they have a lot of shame for having money. Now, this is something I've shared in the past. Like I had a lot of shame for not having money when I was growing up. We were lower middle. And then when I got money, I had a lot of shame for having it because people would be like, oh, he's out of touch, or oh, his life must be so easy, or oh, he can use money to solve all his problems, or oh, he has all this free time, right? There's a shame there. And so if you can understand emotions, you can better connect with people both in the present moment, but as they navigate through their lives. So I want to give simple story that kind of puts this all into perspective, I think about this often, is think about your scary, uncomfortable, I don't like to use the word negative, but let's just say it for now, negative emotions that you might have about money, right? So maybe I mentioned shame, maybe you have a lot of scarcity, maybe you have this kind of catastrophizing mindset that everything can go wrong all at once. Excuse me. And so think about that uncomfortable relationship you have with money. Okay. And let's just say, whatever, you're working and then it's 2008, right? 2008, stock market falls 50% in probably 3 months. Let's say there are days when it's down probably 10%. So you're watching your net worth or hearing about it or actually seeing it in real time plummet. As that is happening, all of these uncomfortable emotions are coursing through your system, right? So you might see the stock market go down 10% and say like, oh my God, my spouse is going to be so angry at me because I made this investing decision, or I'm going to get laid off. That's it. I'm going to get laid off. Like the world's coming to an end, or I need to hunker down. I need to sell right now. All of these emotions, they course through your veins when shit hits the fan, right? And so understanding that this is happening, then this is particularly the case when you're a manager and you're a leader, right? Think about when one of your direct reports makes a big mistake that impacts you as their boss, right? You can lash out at them because of a fear that you're carrying at that moment, like, oh, I'm going to look bad to my big boss. Or you can see them, however you see them, as that childlike fear coming back in, or the shame coming back in. How are you going to show up for that person in that moment? If someone comes to you with immense shame for a mistake that they made, how will you meet that shame? Right? And a lot of it depends on how you meet shame in your own life. Right? So that emotional resonance that flows downstream. I never really thought a lot about emotions. I'm such a cerebral person, so I'm just like problem solution. It's kind of the classic in a heterosexual marriage. Like, oh, the husband's always offering answers, and the wife is always wanting to be heard, right? So I never really thought much about emotions. And I was actually doing this meditation the other day, which a lot of my healing is actually to learn how to better to feel more. And what is feeling? Feeling is emotions. So first, when we talk about emotions, there's so many. I heard somewhere there's like 250 English words for emotions, but they have something called the base levels of emotions, which are sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust. Actually, a lot like Inside Out, the Pixar movie. So if you think about that, right? Happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, surprise. So think about how, and then and you can break it down further. It's like uncomfortable ones, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, and then positive ones, happiness, surprise. But what is your relationship to these emotions, right? And so I wanted to tell you guys about this meditation that I've been doing, where I'm kind of relearning to feel things, right? Because I'm an emotional suppressor, especially on the uncomfortable emotions. Like if anger comes up, I push it down. I don't want to feel that in that moment, right? So if you think about in this meditation, they say that emotions happen at 3 levels. There is a audio level, like you actually say in your head, like I'm angry, or something like I can't believe this person did this to me. Then you might have a visual level where you actually see the anger. Again, you might see the person, or you might see the situation, like your house burning down, leading to fear. So these are pretty, for heady people, the auditory and visual component of emotions are high. For me, it's actually much more auditory than visual. And then there's another layer, is that you always feel something in your body. Now, this is going to be harder for people who live in their heads, but every emotion is an auditory, a visual, and a felt sense in your body, right? Think about these uncomfortable emotions: fear, right? Your chest tightens, anxiety, your neck, also, your ulcer, you start to get ulcers in your stomach, joy, like tingly feelings, warmth in your body, again, usually around uncomfortable emotions, anger, right? How hot you feel when you get angry. And so I encourage you, again, if you're building social intelligence, the self-awareness part is you have to recognize that this is happening in yourself. But the ninja move is when you recognize that it's happening in yourself, and then you see and recognize it happening in others, and then you're able to meet people where they are, right? All right, let's get to our fourth point on social intelligence. And this is emotional intelligence, or understanding other people's perceptions, right? There's that famous line from Atticus Finch that says, you can't understand someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes. Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird says this to his daughter, Scout. You can't understand someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes, right? This is classically known as empathy. And a lot of people will say, well, you're either born or not born with empathy. Like, look, people are predisposed towards being more empathetic and not. But I think that that's complete bullshit, that empathy is a learned skill. One of the most common ways to develop empathy, or easiest ways, is just to observe people. Just observe how people move through the world. In fact, I was just reading an article. There's this new meme on TikTok that's it's called raw dogging a flight. Pardon my French, right? And I won't get into the definition of raw dogging. Go into Urban Dictionary if you're not familiar with this term. I did not come up with it, both the original or the current one. But raw dogging a flight is usually men, for some reason, maybe because men are so much more neurotic about some of these things. But raw dogging a flight is when you sit on a flight and you don't listen to music, you don't watch a movie, you don't read a book, you just observe both your inner state, like what's going on in your head, and your exterior state. Now, I'm not going to be like, I do this all the time, but whenever we have a blank moment, an empty moment, a free moment, we just grab our phones, right? And so how on earth can you develop empathy if we've lost the skill of observation, right? And what can we observe, right? I mean, think about places where so many different socioeconomic perspectives collide, like an airport, right? Or I've always thought jury duty, especially in a big, diverse city like New York. Jury duty, wow. Like, what a waste it would be to go to jury duty in New York and just be on your phone reading the fucking New York Times, when you could be looking at the single mother, the NYU student, the old Asian grandfather who does Tai Chi, the Wall Street billionaire, right? All in the same fucking room. Just observing, how do they carry themselves, their posture? Who do they look at? Who do they not look at? What's their resting emotion? Is it sadness? Is it joy? Is it a lightness? Right? That is how you build empathy, through observation, right? Through raw dogging the world. There are other ways. Obviously, a big one that's getting harder and harder is to just leave your bubble, right? And I'm very, very much guilty of this, kind of prisoner to my bubbles of coasts, of wealthy suburbs, wealthy neighborhoods, of highly educated, highly wealthy social circles, right? I vacation in places where where I vacation are places where you see other New Yorkers and Angelinos, right? So, obviously a very powerful way to further develop empathy is to do volunteer work, right? Lisa and I used to volunteer at a hospice house center. I mean, you want to build empathy around one of people's greatest fears, dying. There's probably no better way than to observe people dying, not only dying, but with 2 weeks to live, observing the family members around them, observing how a nurse, a caretaker tends to someone like that. That is how you build empathy, right? Really, especially when you cut to these core visceral fears. I talked about travel. You don't build empathy by going to a Four Seasons in Punta Minta and then an Aman resort in Bali, and then followed by a W hotel in Paris. I'm sorry, you don't. And by the way, very much how we travel. So kettle meet black, so to speak. But that's something I think about often is real traveling, when you're in with the locals and you understand the customs and you understand the texture of a society, and you see people's joys in certain ways, you see very unique kinds of suffering, and you see very transcendent suffering. Again, we've talked about this in the lens of parenting. It's like, how do you recreate this for kids? Like, do you send them to Habitat for Humanity in, Uganda? I don't know if that exists, but you know what I mean? How do you show, especially when you are of means, how do you show kids or yourself that people who are not of means, while honoring the type of experience that you want to have, right? I feel very conflicted about that. When I travel, I want to travel nice, right? I want to be comfortable. I don't want to be covered in mosquitoes, or I don't want to feel unsafe, right? But being part of the perspective of empathy building, especially through travel, requires some level of discomfort. So more to that on that one. Again, finding communities where no one cares about your status, right? Rock climbing, jujitsu, faith, communities of faith, although maybe there's status within faith. I don't know enough. Volunteer work we talked about, right? Like, can you go into a place where no one gives a fuck that you're managing director, or that you're a partner, or that you sold your company? I know it sounds so obvious, but I don't know. Does it happen that much? That is how you're going to build that empathy muscle, which then can help you deepen your social intelligence with others. There is a very kind of controversial debate on the internet about reading fiction versus nonfiction. I very much see in myself and in many of you listeners that people hate reading fiction because they're like, what's the point? Right? What am I going to learn? I could read a biography about Phil Knight and learn how he built Nike. Or I could read a book about markets that explains to me the origins of the credit crisis. Or I can read a self-improvement book that teaches me, how to be kinder to myself or how to be more creative. I can read Rick Rubin's book. But fiction, that's leisure, right? I mean, we could talk, I'll give a whole separate talk about leisure. But fiction is kind of viewed condescendingly, like, what am I going to get out of this? Very kind of AT, like you may have heard me use this phrase before, where there's no tangible benefit, right? And I would argue, I read mostly fiction, but throughout my career from age 21 to 35, I read pretty much like 98% nonfiction because of all the reasons I just described. But fiction, again, if you can't travel, you can go back. Right? I just started reading Anna Karenina, which is which is such a book that is often used to discuss how you can use fiction literature to understand human nature. And you just have to turn to the first sentence of that book, right? What is it? What is it? All families are miserable, but each is miserable in their own way. I'm paraphrasing. I'm getting it wrong, but wow, to open a book like that, like, I mean, everyone knows what it's like to have family issues. And so this kind of hits hard, right? And so that's the first sentence of the book. A few other books that have been mentioned in the empathy building canon are Anna Karenina, East of Eden, and The Corrections. So I'm definitely re-adding those. I read The Corrections years ago, and I remember really enjoying it. And so I'm going to go back to that one. All right, number 5 on developing social intelligence is understand their layers of suffering, right? To be human is to suffer in some regards, right? And this is a very kind of Eastern philosophical way, but you know this. It's why we have anxiety. It's why we worry. It's why we have envy, right? And so to really connect with someone at this human level, this goes back to observing people, is to really understand, and the emotions, to really understand the layers of their suffering, right? And again, this can be seen in many different ways. Let me use like a very, very simple example is the Enneagram 3, right? And I don't know much about Enneagram, but I know Enneagram 3, I believe it's 3, is the high achiever. They're charismatic. They are very hardworking. They are agency oriented. They are kind of the stars of Western society because they say they're going to do something and they're going to do it, right? A lot of and I didn't even know about Enneagram until about a year ago. A lot of the success that I've had with RadReads and with this podcast and with my writing and my coaching is because so much of what I write and talk about is the other side of that achievement. It's the darker side. It's the lonelier side. It's the scarier side. It's the desire to feel seen. It's the fear of irrelevance. It's the fear of being ordinary, right? And I would argue or posit that much of why you're listening to this right now is because I've been able to connect with you asynchronously, so to speak, at that level and be like, look, I understand this deep level of suffering. Again, not like, oh, I have a boo-boo suffering, but this kind of human condition, existential angst, right? And my ability to connect with that, again, in this very kind of high performer landscape, allows you and I, you listener, you viewer, you reader, to be like, yeah, we see each other, right? Now, look, this is very different. Again, I don't want to anchor too much to personality types, but there are a lot of people that listen to my podcast and they're like, what's the big deal? Who cares? Who cares how much you achieve? Who gives a fuck, right? That person might feel a deeper sense of responsibility to change the world, justice, or they might be action. It's hard for people to imagine this listening to this podcast, but they might be action avoidant. They avoid taking action, right? And so this is where the empathy kicks in. This is where the understanding the emotional layers kicks in. But you might be friends with an artist that is terrified of putting themselves out there, right? You might be friends with a narcissist who cannot see anyone but themselves. How does one connect at that level, right? Because on the other side of narcissism, I'm not a psychotherapist here, but there's probably a whole set of human desires that have gone unmet for this person, right? These fears, these layers of fears, these insecurities, and you can talk to people about this, ask them about it, ask them, with compassion and care, right? I think about this often with envy, right? Envy. I'll admit this, right? I have seen people succeed, people who I care about succeed, and then I create this story in my head, like, well, yeah, but they never see their partner, they never see their kids, right? What is happening in that moment when I see someone, when I should genuinely be happy for what they're about to achieve or what they've achieved, and all I can think about is the bad thing that happened to them, just so I can feel better about myself, right? How would you disentangle that if you were trying to truly deepen a relationship with someone and show them how much that you care, right? That's where the self-awareness part comes in, is to notice these triggers. Notice what triggers you. Someone who's more successful than you, someone who is richer than you, someone who is more confident and charismatic than you. Notice the triggers and then kind of figure out what is unmet in me that inflames me in this moment, and then how am I projecting this towards a peer, a friend, a loved one, right? This disentangling of the layers of suffering. All right, number 6 on social intelligence: be genuine and charismatic, right? And again, this isn't the whole I don't know who's the slickest Brad Pitt. Why the fuck did I say Brad Pitt? But the suave kind of slick back hair, be like, hey, how's Joe, how's Jill, how's that? Like, no, there is a genuineness. I want you to think about, there's a genuineness in the energy that you bring into a room, right? So think about the energy. And if you're younger, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that you need to come in with an energy of overconfidence, right? But what is the energy that you want to enter a room with? I mean, just think about the natural resting state of your face. Is it more of a smile, more of a neutral, more of a frown, right? I mean, RBF, right? Resting bitch face, by the way, applies to all genders. And it doesn't mean that if you have a natural resting bitch face, you should go out and change your resting state. But you can use that as a clue into yourself. What am I bringing into this conversation? What energy am I bringing into this conversation? And again, a lot of the energy that will come in is going to be triggered or incited by what you feel like you lack. If you feel not enoughness, you're going to bring not enoughness energy into a conversation. And that might mean talking over someone. That might mean diminishing their achievements. That might mean being small in the conversation. And again, I'm not saying that you need to go out and, like, please don't say it's like, oh, if I'm a naturally dour person, I need to force myself to be positive. Of course, no. What I am saying, though, is understand your natural dourness. Just pay attention, and pay attention to how it shows up in your conversation. Don't change anything. Just observe, right? This is where meditation becomes very, very powerful. We talked about vibes. We talked about energy. Another, a simple, an obvious one, but hard to actually do regularly, is storytelling. Everyone remembers people who tell great stories, and they particularly remember people who tell great stories to get you to think about the things that you want them to be thinking about, right? This is why so many people love telling stories about Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant or Rick Rubin now for creativity. And again, it doesn't mean that you need to have this backlog. A lot of people take notes of stories. I think that's one step way too far. But again, if you observe people, you observe their decision making, you observe the layers of their emotion, right there you read fiction, right there you've observed this entire tapestry of emotion, of storytelling, right? And storytelling can, paying attention, obviously you can go learn different frameworks for storytelling, hero's journey and storyboard and things like that. But at the same time, you could also just observe and then like retell. Everyone has a story, right? Where it doesn't have to be this like perfect Pixar, perfectly meticulous tale, right? Everyone has a story. In the charismatic thing, if you're struggling, you're like, well, I'm shy or I'm naturally reserved. I think another one that really plays into this is just random, genuine acts of kindness. Very, very small acts of kindness. Like thanking someone for, if someone says something that you find helpful, it's like, oh, thank you for sharing that with me. I had never thought about it that way. Or I'm going to try that at home, right? Obviously, with the proliferation of email and messaging and so on, you can thank people, you can show acts of kindness, sharing a story. I saw Adam Grant posted, he called it pebbles. It's like when you send someone a podcast or a meme or just a little note, like I'm thinking of you. It's a behavior that penguins do when they take pebbles and bring them to different parts. They bring them to their tribe of penguins, and it's an act of love, right? So if you think of these little pebbles that you can give to others, right there, it changes the energy. It shifts the energy towards one of care, of compassion, of thoughtfulness, without being like, oh, I love your dress, or I think your shirt is awesome, or I love your shoes, or how are you so smart, right? All right. Now, the seventh one, this is the last one on how to build social intelligence, is vulnerability. Now, someone just told me the other day about this phrase called trauma porn or trauma flexing, I think. And they were referring to what happens in Austin, Texas, a very kind of spiritually self-improvement minded community. And they said that you'll meet someone for the first time and right away they'll jump into it's like, my dad used to hit me, or I used to, I was so poor when I grew up, my parents couldn't put food on the table. They launch right in. And what people often confuse vulnerability with is just launching into this like, oh, I am so broken, right? Leading with the I am so broken. I've been hurt so much. I don't think that is a version of vulnerability, but I don't think that's the type of vulnerability that we're talking about. Social intelligence, bringing people closer together, right? That vulnerability, I always think about this phrase, meet people where they are, right? So if you think about something we said earlier, mirroring, right? If someone says, hey, I had a hard childhood, right? And you might repeat, first you kind of acknowledge that they said that and, make them feel seen and honor what they've just shared with you with compassion, with grace. And not in a one-upman's way, but if you understand the layers of emotion, the layers of suffering, you can say back, it's like, yeah, it may not be the same, but I remember feeling this aloneness when I used to shoplift. And even though we were middle class, my parents always, my dad was an entrepreneur and we never could have anything. So I shoplifted, right? I'm not saying I did, but I have, but that's not what I'm saying. So, you can kind of meet people where they are. And again, it's not a game of one-upsmanship. It is this kind of shared suffering, this shared emotional layers. Like, I see you, right? And with that vulnerability comes authenticity. With that vulnerability comes relatableness, right? You have to be very aware, self-aware. We talk about the difference between EQ and social intelligence. All of this is it's anchored by this idea of self-awareness. And so as I wrap this episode, I want anytime I give these talks about building better relationships, people immediately come in and jump in and say, oh, it's so tactical. You're taking advantage of people. You're injecting strategies into very human connections. Like, no. I promise you, hand on my heart, that is not what I want you to take away from this. If anything, if I can distill what I've said is understand your own humanness, the beautiful, the terrifying, the mundane. Understand someone else's humanness, the beautiful, the terrifying, the mundane. How do those two interact in a way that is beautiful, in a way that honors one another, in a way that is caring, in a way that shows respect, all while imbuing it with love for from one human to another? Thanks for listening.